Welcome to KRQE's New Mexico News Insiders. Here's Gabrielle Burkhart and Chris McKee. Sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
Chris, when you hear the word microplastic, what do you think? And what kind of feeling does that word invoke for you?
Yeah, it's not a good feeling anymore. I remember news stories from, I don't know, it was probably more than a decade ago about like some of the skincare companies having microplastics in their face washes and how they were phasing that out because they realized, you shouldn't just dump plastic continuously into, the water streams that aren't necessarily set up to filter all of that out in a perfect system. So that was one of the first things that I remember. This was, a long time ago. That's
like years ago?
Yeah, like probably more than a decade ago.
Okay.
And so anyway, point being, it's not a good feeling because I think as you've seen, as the research goes on, there's a lot to suggest that plastic sort of sticks around wherever it can cling to, whether that's the environment. And now as we're sort of seeing, maybe even inside of our own bodies.
It's so bizarre. I feel like this is definitely a newer term that I've started hearing. It's a topic people are making videos about on social media. It's come up more frequently on my timeline for sure. And I know that younger reporters we've talked to in the newsroom, not naming names, but somebody in this newsroom has maybe done some plastic shaming, emphasizing the use of glass to store food when you bring in lunch. Point is, I want to know, what does the science say about the potential harms of plastic? Today's guest has done a lot of research about that. Let's introduce him. From the University of New Mexico Health Sciences Center, Dr. Marcus Garcia. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you guys.
Yeah, you're in the middle of some cutting edge research that we'll get to. But before we sort of get into the topic, I wanted to learn just a little bit more about you. So your UNM Bio Online, it says your research focuses on, quote, assessing health impacts of environmental contaminants such as microplastics and heavy metals, and development of isolation and quantification techniques of microplastics in biological tissues. So maybe from the layperson's perspectives, layperson's point of view, what does that mean and what kind of led you to this research in the first place?
Absolutely. So whenever we talk about environmental factors, especially around microplastics and even heavy metals, the biggest thing is we know that these are toxicants in the environment that we are really interested in learning a little bit more, taking a deeper dive into how these are affecting the body or even just the environment in general. So that's the biggest thing in terms of quantification and identification of these microplastics. You know, even just going back to your introductory statement, talking about like having the plastics in a lot of our beauty products and things along those lines. We now know that they're being deposited into our environment and staying around for an extended period of time. So as it continues to accumulate, how is that going to cause issues for the environment, but ultimately for us? So that was one of the key things is trying to find that technique and develop the methods to be able to look at how much is depositing in our bodies, as well as kind of being able to figure out what dose, because as toxicologists, we always like to say the dose is the poison. So to be able to create a technique to finally tell us exactly how much in terms of microplastics is in these biological tissues is very important to be able to answer a lot of the health and clinical outcomes that are associated with that.
Yeah. And what led you to the research? It's just kind of fascinating stuff to you?
It's very fascinating to me, but one of the biggest things is I'm actually a pharmacist by training. And, you know, even just in medical care, we use a lot of single-use plastic materials. In our day-to-day use, we use a lot of these single-use plastic materials. And, you know, taking a step back and looking to see, I mean, you walk outside every single day and guaranteed you're going to see some form of trash or plastic debris continuing to degrade down. So for me, it was more of that, taking that clinical knowledge that I have and using it in different forms and ways to answer a lot of these questions around like a big environmental factor that we're dealing with right now.
Yeah. So kind of curiosity too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
UNM also often sends out news releases based on some of the research that's happening there. This conversation is based on one of those headlines that grabbed my attention, our attention. It's titled, UNM researchers find alarmingly high levels of microplastics in human brains, and concentrations are growing over time. It notes a new study recently published in Nature Medicine. A team led by toxicologist Dr. Matthew Campen reported that plastic concentrations in the brain appeared higher than in the liver or kidney and higher than in previous reports for placentas and testes. Mm-hmm. So lots to unpack here. One of my first questions, just reading that headline, is what is the sample size of human brains studied here? And the growing over time part, is this something that scientists have been studying for a long time?
So it is a relatively new area of study. So one of the biggest things that I want to start with is being that, I mean, we can't just get human tissues at any point. So this was really a big collaborative effort, and thankfully working with the Office of the Medical Investigator, they were very interested in working to answer some of these questions, and they do have some of these tissues available. So that being said, they were willing to work with us, and based off of the publications, like as you just mentioned, talking about quantification within the placenta as well as within the testes. Those were two previous publications that were coming out using the technology that we're using. And we had done a little bit of studies in terms of mouse brain, liver, as well as the kidney as well too, where we were looking at how dosing with microplastics causes any alterations within metabolomics or the metabolism of within these models. And that led us to kind of say, like, we were seeing these alterations. Now, is there a way to be able to start looking at that in terms of human health? And even just being able to get some of these tissues. So being able to do that and working with them extensively to collect these tissues, as well as other collaborators out of state to add to not only like a New Mexico example, but also how is this impacting kind of on a national scale.
So how big is the sample size?
So in terms of the overall study, with this one, we had over 50 different tissues that we were able to look at. Of course, within our final sample that we were analyzing, that was a little bit smaller, but overall, giving us a good example from a wide range of different ages as well too, because that was going to be a big question that we wanted to answer. Is it because, as we know, plastics in the environment doubles not only in production, but also the deposition of what we're calling these microplastics as they degrade every 10 to 15 years. So we wanted to see, is an individual who's been alive longer having more of an accumulation effect as compared to somebody who maybe is a little bit younger, things along those lines. And that actually wasn't a factor. It's more of because we're seeing more plastics in the environment now in 2024 and now in 2025 as compared to like in 2016 when we were looking at these samples. That's where we're seeing that linear increase in biological samples as well too.
Wow.
Okay.
So high level, if we're going back to, say, the scientific method and the standards there, step one, what was the question or the observation your research focused on? And, can you give us also a basic definition of what is a microplastic?
Yeah.
How small are these pieces?
Yeah. So to start off with the definition of a microplastic, usually those are anything less than 5 millimeters in size. So pretty much like the size of a grain of rice. So that was the first thing is, okay, now we're focusing on microplastics and trying to answer that question. A lot of work around microplastics has really been done more in the marine environment. I mean, as we hear about the garbage patch the size of Texas that's sitting in the Pacific Ocean, that's where a lot of this research started. But really the question is, knowing that, how is that affecting things that are here on land? And especially here in New Mexico, we are a landlocked state. So how is that going to play a role in everything? So that was kind of the thought is, we're seeing these in a lot of our marine life. They've been doing a lot of studies around soils and even just looking at irrigation and our water sources. So seeing those there. So that was kind of the initial thought. Okay, we are seeing them in the environment, but how are we going to be able to see these in biological tissues? And that's where we started looking, and there was some technology out there before where they could be able to just see these plastics and use like some. It's more of infrared spectroscopy. So pretty much shooting a laser at it to be able to kind of give you a read back saying like, oh, this is polyethylene, for example, or polystyrene, something like that. But that was also limited to pretty much the maximum size of what a microplastic is. So anything up to about 5 millimeters in size. So for us, our big question is we know that there's a lot more things that are less and smaller in those sizes. So that's where we wanted to develop this technique to be able to answer that question is like, we know that we're just at the limit of technology as it is. So we want to take that the next step further. So to kind of talk about that technology a little bit, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, okay, so the question is like, how is this impacting possibly our biology and people here on land, humans? When you talk about the sample size, okay, you guys were looking at 50 tissues, for example. Now tell us about the research. What kind of methods were you using to answer this question?
Yeah, so in terms of that, we use this technology called pyrolysis gas chromatography mass spectrometry. So what that does is we're able to take this biological tissue, and we need just like 500 milligrams. So just to kind of give you like a little visualization, it's almost just like a little tiny square of any tissue that we're interested in using, right? So then what we're going to do from there is we use a very basic solution. So it's 10% potassium hydroxide. And what that does is it allows the tissues to completely dissolve out, so breaking down that biological matrix. After that is done, what we do is we use a technique called ultracentrifugation, so really spinning these things down at very, very high speeds, so usually about 100,000 Gs. So a lot of times, like you take into perspective, like a fighter pilot, like they're hitting maximums of about 7 Gs. So you're, exponentially higher. So what that allows us to do is isolate the plastic out, because what it's going to do is it's going to sediment to the bottom of our tube that we're using to isolate these. And then we do some extensive cleaning just to remove any of the excess liquid, allow that to dry. And then we put this in our pyrolysis gas chromatography system. So what that does is it uses combustion. So literally, as soon as this pellet goes into a furnace, pretty much that's at 600 degrees centigrade, it combusts all that into a gaseous form. Well, within those gases, that's where we're able to create a fingerprint specific for all of these different polymers. So we were able to quantify up to 12 polymers at the moment. Just to list a few: polyethylene, polypropylene, polyvinyl chloride, polyethylene terephthalate, as well as nylons. So a lot of these are seen in our everyday use products and things.
These are types of plastic.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So then from there is based off of that fingerprinting, we have a known standard concentration of these 12 different polymers, and we can use some software as well as calculating out exactly how much of that plastic is present based off of that standard.
Wow.
And then that's where we get our dose of, say, our rough estimates where this was around like 4,800 micrograms per gram of tissue. So that's specifically for the brain. So just to kind of give you an idea of how we're able to say like what amount we're seeing in these tissues as well. And then seeing that consistent across all of the different samples as well.
Wow.
So seeing some of the stuff of like what's been left over, in the Nature Medicine article, you can see some of the images of these kind of like shard or flake-like particles that you found inside, again, people's brains. It is pretty crazy to think about. How did those pieces of plastic get there, do you think? And how big are these shards that you're finding?
Yeah, so it was very surprising to see that initially. So that's actually one of the big things is we don't have a definitive mechanism, is what we call it, is how it's actually getting in there right now. One of our main thoughts is, and we've done a little bit of investigating, of course, using a mouse model, is uptaking these through our dietary fats. So as we know, our brains have a lot of fat in them as well too. So as we consume our food products and as they digest, and what was another very interesting finding within this is these are actually even going a step further, nanoplastics, which I'll give a little bit of a definition after I give this. But what ends up happening is those nanoplastics will actually hitchhike into our dietary fats, which get distributed throughout our body for nutrients, energy sources, and things along those lines. So that's one of the ways that we're saying it's potentially getting in there. And then in terms of overall accumulation, we know that the brain has a high metabolism, but doesn't necessarily have a mechanism to allow as much stuff out, like as we would see within the liver and kidney. Like that's what their job is to filter out any of these toxins or anything. So that's one of the main thoughts as to why we're seeing more of that accumulation.
We'll be right back with more of the New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Logan Rader, host of New Mexico Living. New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS. If you like New Mexico News Insiders, learn more about New Mexico in Focus, a weekly hour-long show analyzing decisions impacting New Mexico statewide. Stream it anytime, anywhere. Visit nmpbs.org and follow them on all social media platforms. Now back to New Mexico News Insiders.
Okay, so we use plastic in a lot of things, obviously. Your team noted also finding high concentrations of plastic in meat bought at the grocery store, for example. So when you think of buying meat, it's all usually wrapped tightly in plastic at the grocery store. Is this potentially a bad thing? Talk to us about how plastic has seemingly entered our food chain.
Absolutely. And I think you bring up two very good points. Is the first one is all the wrapping that we're using. I mean, even the plastic cups that we're using on a day-to-day basis, things along those lines. It is very important to be wary about those kinds of things. But the fact is you're not going to get as much of your microplastics exposure from that cup or that piece of plastic that's covering your food products when you first purchase them. It's what happens to that after it ends up in a landfill. So after we throw these away, then they're continuing to degrade in these types of environments for the next 20, 30 years. So that's kind of the biggest concern, is because what ends up happening is through sunlight, even just like the packing down of these landfills, so that mechanical degradation, that's what causes these plastics to break down into these much finer micro as well as nanoplastics. Then those end up leaching out into our groundwaters, into our soils. And then what do we use those for? For
watering crops.
Exactly, exactly. So we use them for watering crops, and then there's just that bioaccumulation.
Animals drink it, probably.
Exactly. And then even further is those crops get consumed by our livestock that are being used for us to consume as well too. So it's that same bioaccumulation factor that happens within our bodies is our livestock are consuming these products, they get that accumulation in those tissues. We use a lot of that in our dietary day-to-day life as well too, and then we consume that, and then it just continues to accumulate within us. So that's one of the biggest things that we were also very interested in investigating, and it was actually fun to be able to look at like those types of products, because we have a lot of students that come over the summer that are either high school, undergrad, as well as like we still continue to have our PhD and PharmD students. But this was a project that we got to work in collaboration with some high school students to give them that exposure and show the equipment and be able to work with that and have that and even be able to present that at more of a national scale, which some of them are going to be able to do next week at our Society of Toxicology conference in Orlando. So
wow. So this, thinking back again to the grocery store meat, it might not just be like the plastic that it's covered in, but you're saying like it's in the meat. It's
in the meat itself, yes.
Should we be afraid to eat that meat?
Well, there's still so much that needs to be unpacked with all of this. People are still living well past their 80s and 90s. But of course, too, as we're seeing more accumulation in the environment, these are things that at a certain point, it is going to be a cause for concern. And that's the big reason why we're really working towards answering that question, and why this study was so important is to be able to identify that first point of like, how much do we have currently? And then as we continue to go on over the next couple of years, how is that going to affect us ultimately in the end?
Yeah. Wow. Your study also noted brain tissue from people who had been diagnosed with dementia had up to 10 times as much plastic in their brains as everyone else. But while there is a correlation, you can't maybe tell us at this point whether higher levels of plastic in the brain caused that dementia or dementia symptoms, or whether they may accumulate more due to the disease process itself.
Absolutely.
But I wanted to talk about that finding. Does it suggest anything to you that, potentially maybe there is some causation there between microplastics and disease? Potentially,
yes, absolutely. And that's actually one of the main things that's highest on our radar. So right now we're working with a lot of pathologists as well as other individuals who really focus on Alzheimer's and dementia to really answer this question. But again, as you just mentioned, right now, all we can say is it's more of a correlation, not a causation. So just to give an example for like these neurodegenerative type of disorders, a lot of times the barriers that help protect these toxicants or things from getting into the brain, those are broken down much further in these types of diseases. So that is part of the reason why we're able to see a lot more plastics in those samples, for example. So now, again, as I mentioned, we want to make sure that as we're now seeing how much is there, answer that question is like, is it still just more of a correlation, or is there a specific causation that may be amplifying that a little bit more as well too, which is something that is, very high on our list.
Yeah, fascinating. And as somebody who's studying this impact, even thinking about the dementia correlation potentially, what exactly is it about plastic that contributes to it being potential harmful to our bodies? Is it toxicity from it, or just the sheer physical characteristics of it potentially blocking arteries, for example?
There could be a mix of both. So there's a lot of research going around recently too, where, looking at all the different chemicals that are used to make these plastics. So as those continue to degrade, you're going to start to see a lot more of that even leaching into the environment, potentially into our bodies as well too. So you've been hearing, I'm sure as you guys have been learning more about this, you've heard something around like endocrine disruption, hormone imbalance. So there's a lot of things that are still being unpacked on a day-to-day basis. And microplastics research is still in its infancy in a lot of ways, especially around like human physiology. So those are things that we're really taking into consideration and learning more on a day-to-day basis. And even just to see the overall research community taking that into perspective, not only from like the physical chemistry, but also clinicians really focusing on trying to answer a lot of these questions is very important, because we are seeing a lot of changes just within our everyday health as well too. So wanting to answer a lot of those questions.
Yeah.
We know based on your research that essentially we can say, is plastic that there, I guess the answer is yes, there is plastic being found in human brains.
Right.
The toxicologist said in the news release related to this research, quote, "I have yet to encounter a single human being who says, there's a bunch of plastic in my brain and I'm cool with that," right? I think we can all agree with that exactly. So presuming that we are all not exactly cool with the finding, what can we do about it? Are there any suggestions you have for people to maybe avoid this stuff in the future? Any changes people could be making in their daily lives?
Yeah, absolutely. There's always something that we can do in our daily lives to be more wary of all the plastics that are even just around on a day-to-day use. Being able to figure out better ways of recycling is one of those. And even at that, I feel like it even goes further beyond that. In a lot of ways, I think now we're at a point where a lot of policies around these plastics and their use and things needs to be in place. Even just after they're done, seeing how much is just ending up in landfills, that's going to be an important thing is figuring out policies or ways in which we can remove some of that, which is ultimately leaching into our environment over the years. That's going to be a key factor. Some of the thoughts that we've had is, being able to create waste to energy treatment plants that we can use to pull a lot of these out and use them for more of an energy source. I mean, we see a lot of industries in Europe who have really implemented a lot of these ideas and been very successful with them.
Yeah, these are basically plants that burn garbage and filter the exhaust that comes out of it. Right?
Exactly, and then being able to use it as an energy source as well too. So those are some of the ways that we're really thinking and really feel that can play a factor, especially because I mean, there's only so much we can do on our day-to-day life. I mean, of course, like it was mentioned earlier, is using glassware wherever possible, being very wary of like the plastic materials and stuff that we're seeing being packaged. But then it does go beyond that to be able to say like, okay, well, we know that even after we're done with those products, they're just going to sit here in this landfill for the next 30 to even, I mean, sometimes 100 years. And you got to think about it from this perspective is, you know, that piece of plastic that you're using right now may not directly affect you, but it may be affecting your children, your grandchildren, their grandchildren. So it's more of a looking into the future kind of thing as well too, and what we can do better to better manage our environment and be wary of those things.
Yeah. When we think about solutions, it's sounding to me from what you're explaining that the solution is more broad and global potentially, but back to our original comments again, like, does it make a difference how you store your food? Like if your meat is stored in plastic at the grocery store, or just putting it into a glass container when you get home, you know, keeping it in glass, does that make any sort of difference at this point?
So in a lot of ways, like with those types of containers, a lot of times, like you still may get some microplastic exposure, but in a lot of ways, like we're thinking about macro, so like larger pieces. So in those types of things, our body has a good way of being able to, like if we do consume some of those larger pieces, being able to get them out of our body. But of course too, like there still could be some of that exposure. So just like I say, is just being really, really cautious with what you're using on a day-to-day basis. Even just how you're storing things, processing them, even as you're getting ready to cook these items, even like the materials that you're using within that cookware is also going to be very important.
Yeah, I mean, and that kind of one of the questions we outlined that really hits on there is, you know, I think many of us have heard at this point, you know, with this whole glass plastic debate, is like one of the things is perhaps we shouldn't be heating up our food in plastic. Is that a contributor, do you think, to microplastics as well? Or is that more of still the larger pieces?
In terms of microplastics, there may be some, especially as you reheat them multiple times.
Right.
What is
the actual. Exactly.
So there is that. What is more concerning is going to be more of that chemicals that as you're warming it up, may be leaching out. So it's still in terms of plastic contamination, but more of like the chemicals that were used to make those plastics that may be leaching out into that at that point. So
my grandma always taught me not to put plastic in the microwave.
Yeah.
So it's something our grandparents seemed to know about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
And just because plastic is so common in our lives, is there any going back? I mean, or is this just a substance that is so ingrained in our everyday lives, the water, the crops, animals we're eating?
It really does feel like a Pandora's box thing once it's open. You know,
and
it's everywhere.
And that is the big thing is I think that being that there is so much in plastics production started back in like the 1950s. And again, just going back to that original statement where we've seen a doubling of not only plastic production every 10 to 15 years, but also that's when it starts to have that breakdown. And I think that just being that it's kind of that out of sight, out of mind. I mean, we couldn't see these things initially. So we didn't understand how they were breaking down or what was going on. So that's going to be the big thing that we do want to say is like, and why we think that a lot of these policies need to be put in place is to be able to understand that we do have such a high amount in the environment, and it's going to take quite quite a while for us to be able to really start seeing a difference of getting them out. But it all has to start somewhere. And now that we know that they're there and in the amounts that we're seeing them there, we all need to work together to be able to have a better way of managing these things and getting them out of our environment to help our future generations more than anything.
I just think about it, plastic bags get used for prescriptions. They're in the containers, plastic wrap, how much of that gets used in moving these days. It really is used everywhere.
Yeah. And I mean, even in a lot of ways, like putting my clinical hat back on, medicine, for example, couldn't advance as far as it has without these types of products. You know what I mean? So they do have their uses, but then again, it's like if it's just a one and done kind of thing, and then they end up just sitting in a landfill for the next 50 years and continue to break down, that's where the big problem is. So even being able to answer a lot of these questions around, okay, how do we better manage that waste after it's done? I mean, in a lot of ways, there isn't, like for medical devices or things along those lines, there isn't certain ways to be able to recycle these.
There's not great alternatives.
Exactly.
Right
now. So that's where we're thinking like these waste to energy management treatment plants, kind of things along those lines, where we know that they're still going to have a use, but it's not going to ultimately impact the environment in the former fashion that it currently is at the moment.
We'll be right back with more on New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Monica Wicki, host of New Mexico Living. This episode of New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS. If you enjoy New Mexico News Insiders, check out New Mexico in Focus, a great source for insights about what's happening in our state. Catch their podcasts and videos at nmpbs.org or stream it anytime, anywhere on the free PBS app. Now, let's continue to New Mexico News Insiders.
One of the last questions I have, this is from the unnamed coworker I mentioned earlier. If a person doesn't use plastic water bottles, plastic bags, or Tupperware, totally avoids heating up frozen meals in plastic, can this person also assume that they are more in the clear than others who regularly use plastic? Some of the concerns this person mentioned, swallowing the equivalent of a credit card or potentially impacting fertility.
Yeah, so I think you bring up a lot of great points, and I think that that's a great question. It is one of those things, though, where just being able to know now that we are getting it so highly through our foods, that's what makes it a little tricky. So they're doing everything correct in terms of trying to minimize their exposure. But again, too, it's just because we know that there's so much more in our food products and things along those lines that they aren't 100% free of any of that type of contamination as well, too. But again, I think that this is where we need to be more wary about these types of things and really work to help solve this issue.
Do you know whether it impacts fertility at this point?
So there has been some studies out there. Knowing that plastics can work as endocrine disruptors, there are a lot of papers out there that are discussing this. So there is that potential. Now, in terms of like where our research is going, right now I'm more focused on the placenta, as well as like starting to look at fertility. So this will be something that we'll be answering here in the next couple of years, probably even sooner than that. But it is something that is very important to be able to answer, because we are seeing a correlation between the amount of plastics in the environment versus like male fertility, for example. It's almost like an inverse relationship. As more plastics are in our environment, we're seeing less or lower sperm counts or less fertility in men, as well as like starting to see that in women as well too. So these are very important factors that we're seeing a lot of the data coming out that is linking to that. And we really need to answer and again, use the information that we're able to gain, not only as scientists but clinicians, to answer these questions and make people more aware and figure out ways in which we can reduce that as well.
Okay, so similar to the dementia finding, it sounds like you're seeing a correlation, but not necessarily a clear answer.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And I think that the key point is and with this study, it is that now that we know the exact amount that's there, that's really going to be the point, because whenever we talk about one thing I'm sure you guys have heard throughout all of this is the dose makes the poison. So again, kind of going back to that is like, you think about water. Water's great for us, but too much of it can also hurt us, right? So it's kind of that same concept. Like now that we're able to figure out what that threshold is of microplastics in our body, that is ultimately going to take us off the edge or cause a lot more of these health impacts. That's why this study is so important, to be able to now use that information and link it to these clinical outcomes, which in a lot of our collaborations, we're already starting to do that. And we're having a lot of secondary publications coming out, even just based off of the placenta paper that was out last February, as well as other things as well too. So.
Wow.
Is there anything else you want people to know about the research you're doing into this subject? Or it sounds like, some of the questions you have revolve around the fertility question, around, what happens when you're finding microplastics in placentas. But what are the things you want to explore further, and what do you want people to know about this research?
Absolutely. So my main area of focus is around reproductive health. So really hitting on a lot of the points that you were talking about today is really trying to answer a lot of that. And also too, just making sure that people understand a little bit more about what's going on in our day-to-day. Like I mentioned, is, we can't see these things, so we may not necessarily be understanding or even think that they're there. But now to be able to uncover that we are seeing these plastics, and specifically in the nano size as well. So these very small things that you can only see under a very strong microscope as well too. So just thinking about those types of things and really working around what we can do not only in our day-to-day lives, but also talking with those people who may also have a voice in policy making or things along those lines. I think in order to push and move the needle, we have to all come together and do that as well. So I think that's going to be a key point that we need to really address. Another thing, and this is just a little shameless plug for my own kind of thing is with this research being such a new area, I'm really thankful as a native New Mexican. I mean, I was born and raised in Las Vegas, New Mexico. So also giving that opportunity to be somebody who is a native, and allowing other individuals or even allow the next future generations to be able to say like, hey, like this is somebody from my hometown that is doing this type of work, and it may be something that they may be interested in. So always want to think about that and think about our community and the people around us, and being able to put a face to a name in a lot of ways, or learn a little bit more about where I come from. And to be able to answer any questions that some of these people may not know where to go to as well too. So that's just my little 2 cents in addition. But yeah, thank you guys for that.
Yeah. Is there anything that you do differently in your personal life now based on this research? Do you avoid plastic at all costs?
I mean, I'm more weary about it. I do use glassware in my everyday Tupperware products or things along those lines. Even just using like specific mugs that aren't those types of materials. Yeah, I do that. But also too, I know that in a lot of ways it's hard to get rid of those types of things. And I mean, just being more cognizant of those types of factors is something that I pay attention to. Like even going to the grocery store, I mean, do I get a 3-pack of cucumbers that maybe only has one set of wrapping, or there's also ones that are each individually wrapped? Do we really need to do something like that? So it's just like, I know that it's already done in terms of to the consumer's hands, but just in my day-to-day, do I need to purchase that product and then use that and add that to the environment as well too? So those are some of the small things that we can do, but this is also, again, on a much grander scale that we need to really consider.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Dr. Garcia, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
No, thank you guys. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Again, thanks to UNM researcher Dr. Marcus Garcia for that conversation. I think one of the really interesting points is the response that's been from their research, that's come from their research. We were talking to them on their way out, and they said they had more than, I think, 60 media inquiries. International media has really latched on to this because, it is a topic everybody wants to know about.
Yeah, and he did make a point to say, some of this research is very much in its infancy. They're still trying to figure out the answers to a lot of the burning questions that we have, that other people might have as well. So we will link to their research and the article in that Nature Medicine article that we mentioned in the show notes, and also in our web article that you can look at. It's krqe.com/podcasts. You can watch the full version of this on our KRQE YouTube channel and catch us on Fox New Mexico Wednesday nights at 10:30. And in the meantime, if you have any story ideas or people you'd like to hear from on our show, feel free to reach out. I'm Gabrielle.Burkhart@krqe.com via email, and GBurkNM on social media.
I'm at Chris McKee TV, also Chris.McKee@krqe.com. Thanks for listening.